It was early autumn when I decided to camp near an old graveyard deep in the woods. I had heard about the place from an older coworker who used to go hunting nearby. He said it wasn't well known, just an overgrown burial site from the late 1800s that no one really visited anymore. It wasn't marked on most maps, and you had to hike a few miles off the nearest dirt road to find it. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, and I wasn't the kind of person to get scared easily. To me, it was just another remote place to set up camp, enjoy some solitude, and maybe even test myself a little. I had been on plenty of solo trips before, camping in places far more remote than this. The graveyard itself was just a detail, nothing more. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road and hiked in with my gear. The trail was rough and overgrown, clearly not traveled often. The air smelled like damp earth, fallen leaves, and the lingering scent of pine. Every now and then, I heard a distant bird call or the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. It took me about 2 hours to reach the graveyard. When I finally stepped into the clearing, I was a little surprised by how untouched it felt. The headstones were weathered, covered in moss, and half buried in the ground. Some of them had crumbled completely, just broken slabs sticking out of the earth. There were no signs of recent visitors, no flowers, no footprints, nothing. It was completely silent, except for the occasional sound of the wind moving through the trees. I picked a spot near the edge of the graveyard, just inside the tree-line. It gave me some cover, but still allowed me to see most of the clearing. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything organized before the sun started to set. As I worked, I kept looking at the headstones, wondering about the people buried there. Some of the dates went back to the early 1800s. Most of the names were too worn to read. By the time night fell, I had a small fire going, and I sat back against a log to eat my dinner. The air had turned cold, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks up into the dark sky. I didn't feel scared, just alone. It was the kind of quiet that settled deep into your bones, making you feel like the only person in the world. As the night went on, I started to hear strange noises in the distance. At first, I assumed it was just the forest, branches snapping, animals moving around. But after a while, I noticed a pattern. The sounds weren't random. It was as if something was circling the clearing, moving just beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard something new. A low, rhythmic crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, my body tense. The sound stopped the moment I moved. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the thick wall of forest beyond the graveyard. But the feeling didn't go away. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Every time I started to relax, I'd hear it again. Something moving, watching. It never came closer, never showed itself. But it was there. At some point, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and kept my knife close. I told myself it was just an animal, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to a new sound, something much closer. A shuffling, scraping noise like fabric dragging across the ground. I held my breath. The sound was coming from just outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it so tightly my fingers ached. Slowly, I turned it on and aimed it at the tent wall. There was a shadow, a human-shaped shadow. It stood motionless, inches away from me. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at that shape through the thin fabric. Then, without warning, it stepped away. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, unzipped the tent, and shined my light outside. Nothing. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The clearing was empty. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the trees. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves. But there was nothing else. I should have packed up and left. But I didn't. I told myself it was exhaustion messing with my head. Maybe a trick of the light, a hallucination from being alone for too long. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When the sun finally came up, I stepped out of my tent and walked around the clearing. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, circling my tent. Barefoot. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking the entire time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to rest. I just grabbed my stuff and left. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. That same presence watching me from the trees. By the time I reached my truck, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then, just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. I didn't look twice. I started the truck, threw it into reverse, and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I had been camping all my life. Growing up in North Carolina, my dad took me out into the woods more weekends than not, and I kept the habit well into adulthood. It was a way to clear my head, get away from work, and just breathe for a while. This trip was supposed to be no different. I had planned a solo camping weekend in the Croatan National Forest, an area I had been to before but never fully explored. It wasn't the most popular spot, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no noise, just me and the trees. I packed up my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, water, a hunting knife, a hatchet, and a small camping stove. I always carried a .357 revolver when I went solo, just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but the woods weren't as safe as people like to think. Animals, unpredictable weather, and sometimes even other people could be real dangers. It was early October, the best time for camping. The summer heat had faded, but the real cold hadn't set in yet. The forest was alive with color, deep oranges, reds, and yellows. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, reaching the edge of the forest just as the sun started dipping toward the horizon. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one other truck parked in the gravel lot. I checked my pack one last time, shouldered it, locked up my truck, and started down the trail. The first few hours were uneventful. I hiked deep into the woods, following a path that split off from the main trail. I had studied the maps beforehand and knew this route led to a clearing near a small creek, a good place to set up camp. It was far enough from the main camping areas that I likely wouldn't see another person all weekend. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows through the trees. I worked quickly to set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. I ate a quick meal, just a simple freeze-dried meal with some beef jerky. The air was cool, the forest silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I should have felt at peace, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was that feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see anyone. I scanned the woods, but everything looked normal. Just trees, thick and endless in every direction. I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, adding more wood to the fire and letting the warmth settle my nerves. That night, I barely slept. I must have woken up 5 or 6 times, each time feeling like I had heard something outside my tent. Leaves crunching, a twig snapping. But every time I unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight around, there was nothing. Just the dark trees standing still in the cold air. I finally drifted into a light sleep just before dawn, waking up feeling groggy and uneasy. I stepped out of the tent, stretched, and went to relieve myself near the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Fresh ones. They weren't mine. I knew exactly where I had walked, and these were different, lighter, smaller, but definitely from an adult. They came from the treeline, stopped about 15 feet from my tent, then turned back the way they came. Someone had been watching me. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was another camper passing through, curious but harmless. But why wouldn't they say anything? And why stand there in the dark, watching? I decided I wasn't going to let it ruin my trip. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up some supplies, and decided to spend the day hiking deeper into the forest. If someone was nearby, I wanted to put some distance between us. I followed the creek upstream for miles, moving through dense forest and rocky hills. The deeper I went, the less I felt that uneasy feeling. By midday, I was sweating despite the cool air, and I sat on a fallen log to rest and drink some water. That's when I heard it. Not an animal, not the wind, a whistle, a slow, deliberate whistle. 3 notes, rising and falling. It sounded human. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound came from somewhere ahead of me, deep in the trees. I sat completely still, straining to hear more. Silence. I waited for what felt like forever. No movement, no more whistling. Nothing. I didn't like it. Something about it felt wrong. Whistling in the woods wasn't unheard of. Hunters sometimes used it to signal each other, but I hadn't seen any sign of other hunters. I decided to turn back. As I retraced my steps, the feeling of being watched returned. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker. I moved quickly but carefully, not wanting to make too much noise. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A piece of blue fabric. It was caught on a low branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. A torn piece of cloth, like from a jacket or a shirt. It wasn't there when I came this way earlier. I kept moving, faster now. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was already low. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. As I worked, I kept looking at the treeline, scanning for any movement. Nothing. Then, just as I was securing my pack, I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees, barely visible in the fading light. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, standing perfectly still. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking fast. I didn't run. Running in the woods could get you hurt, but I moved as quickly as I could without making it obvious that I was fleeing. I kept my hand near my revolver, ready to draw it if I had to. The figure didn't follow. Not that I could see. I walked for miles, not stopping until I saw the first sign of the parking lot. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then, just before I turned the key, I looked in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the trees, stood the man, still, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted, but I never went back to those woods again. I don't know why I agreed to go on that camping trip. Maybe I needed to clear my head. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could still handle being alone in the wilderness. I used to camp a lot when I was younger, but life had pulled me away from it. Work, responsibilities, getting older, those things creep up on you. It was late October and I had time off work. I figured I'd do something different instead of wasting my days off sitting at home. I chose a remote area, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived, somewhere deep in the woods where I wouldn't run into too many people. I didn't want the typical campground experience. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, just me and nature. I packed light but smart. A tent, sleeping bag, a basic cooking setup, a hatchet, a knife, my rifle, just in case of wildlife. I also had my GPS, a physical map, and enough supplies for 4 days. I wasn't planning on doing anything crazy, just some hiking, fishing, and sitting by the fire. The drive was uneventful. I stopped at a small town to get some extra food and gas. The guy at the station asked where I was headed, and when I told him, he raised an eyebrow. He said that area was tricky, easy to get turned around in. Just be careful, he told me. I nodded, thanked him, and drove on. I reached the trailhead in the early afternoon. The sky was overcast, the air crisp. It smelled like damp leaves and earth. I parked my truck, double-checked my gear, and started my hike in. The trail was barely a trail. It was more like an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. I followed it for about an hour before cutting off into the deeper woods. The trees grew thicker, and the world around me got quieter. That's what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just the sound of the wind and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. By the time I found a good spot to set up camp, the sun was starting to dip. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream. A good place, flat ground, a decent view of the trees in all directions, and plenty of firewood nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going before dark. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, feeling the warmth of the flames against the cold air. It was peaceful. I watched the stars appear, listened to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt right. Then, as the night deepened, I started getting that feeling. You know the one, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, when your gut tightens for no reason. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I was alone out here, surrounded by darkness. My senses were just heightened. I forced myself to ignore it and crawled into my tent. I slept lightly, waking up every so often to the distant hoot of an owl or the cracking of branches in the night. That was normal. The forest is always moving, always alive. But at some point in the night, something woke me up. Not a sound exactly, more like an absence of sound. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. That unnatural stillness pressed in around me. I listened, holding my breath. Then, somewhere in the trees, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal too heavy, too precise. They stopped for a long moment, then moved again, circling the edge of my campsite. I lay there, gripping my knife, forcing myself to breathe quietly. I thought about grabbing my rifle, but I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps came closer. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot, someone or something, just beyond the light of my dying fire. I stayed frozen, listening, heart hammering. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I heard something retreating into the woods. A slow, measured pace. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife, waiting. When dawn finally came, I crawled out of my tent, stiff and exhausted. The fire had burned down to embers. I looked around, searching for any sign that someone had been there. No footprints. No broken branches. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the forest shifting, playing tricks on my tired mind. I decided to stay another night. I told myself I was overreacting. If I packed up and left now, I'd feel like an idiot. The second day went fine. I hiked, fished a little, kept my mind occupied. But that feeling of being watched never really went away. The forest around me felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger. I kept my rifle close, stayed up later than the night before. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. Then, just like before, the footsteps started. Slow, careful, closer this time. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around, and aimed toward the sound. I couldn't see anything beyond the fire's glow, just darkness and shifting shadows. But I knew something was there. I waited, barely breathing. Then something moved, just at the edge of the firelight. A figure, tall, human-shaped, but I couldn't make out any features. It stood there, watching me. I raised my rifle. "Go," I muttered under my breath. Though I knew it wouldn't listen, the figure didn't move. I fired, a warning shot into the trees. The blast echoed through the night, and then it was gone. No running, no sound, just gone. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as dawn broke, I packed my gear, moving fast, barely stopping to eat. I hiked back the way I came, checking my map, making sure I was on track. Then I noticed something. I had been walking for hours, but the terrain didn't look right. The trees, the hills, nothing looked familiar. I should have been close to my truck by now, but instead, I was deeper in the woods. I checked my GPS dead. The battery had drained overnight, even though I had charged it fully before leaving. My map made no sense. The landscape didn't match. It was like I had stepped into a different place entirely. Panic crept in. I forced myself to stay calm, to think. I needed to keep moving. I needed to find the road. The sun was setting. My legs burned. My throat was dry. Then, ahead of me, I saw something. A cabin. Old, weathered, sitting in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. But night was coming, and I needed shelter. I approached slowly, rifle ready. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rot. The walls were covered in deep scratches, like something had clawed at them over and over. And on the floor, near the cold ashes of an old fire, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A backpack. My backpack. The one I had left at my campsite. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed, gasping, the sky turning black above me. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road. My truck was a few yards away. My hands were scraped raw, my boots caked in mud. I had no memory of how I got there. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop. I didn't look in the mirror. I haven't been camping since. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had always loved being out in the wilderness, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life. It was something I had done many times before, but this trip felt different. I didn't know why at the time, but looking back, I should have trusted that uneasy feeling I had from the start. I chose a remote camping spot deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It was a place I had visited a few years earlier with some friends, but this time I wanted to be alone. The idea of spending a few days with nothing but the sounds of nature was appealing. No phone, no work, no responsibilities. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon, my truck kicking up dust as I pulled off the gravel road onto the narrow trail leading to the clearing. The site was just as I remembered. A flat stretch of dirt surrounded by thick trees, with a small stream running a short distance away. There were no other campers around, which was exactly what I wanted. I took my time setting up my tent, making sure everything was in order before the sun set. As the daylight faded, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick around me. Everything felt peaceful. I sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames dance, listening to the occasional rustling of leaves. It wasn't until I was lying in my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, that the uneasy feeling returned. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was just the silence, too heavy and unnatural. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint sound outside my tent. It was subtle, like a footstep in the dirt. I held my breath, waiting. The sound didn't come again. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. I forced myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I stepped outside, stretching my sore limbs. The fire had died down to cold embers, and the woods were eerily still. I looked around, scanning the ground for any sign that something had been near my tent. Nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent the day hiking, following the trails deeper into the woods. The landscape was beautiful. Tall trees, patches of wildflowers, the distant sound of a stream. It was the kind of place that made you forget the rest of the world existed. But that strange feeling never fully left me. Every so often, I would stop and look around, feeling like I was being watched. There was never anything there. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping below the trees. I was exhausted, my legs aching from the miles I had walked. I rebuilt the fire, cooked some food, and tried to push away the unease. Night fell, and with it came the silence. Too quiet. I sat by the fire for a long time, listening. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance, but that wasn't unusual. Animals moved through the woods all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finally crawled into my tent, pulling the sleeping bag tight around me. It took a long time to drift off. Then, in the dead of night, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I knew animals didn't move like that. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a deer. I reached for the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My fingers curled around the handle, my grip tight. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire pit was as I had left it, my gear untouched. But the ground, there were footprints, human footprints. A shiver ran through me. I wasn't alone out here. I made the decision to leave that morning. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the back of my truck. The uneasy feeling hadn't left me, and I wasn't about to wait around to see who or what had been watching me. As I drove away, back onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just before the trees swallowed the campsite, I thought I saw something move between the trunks. A shadow, a figure. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I never went camping alone after that. I never liked camping in the rain. I didn't mind rain when I was home, sitting on my couch with a warm drink, listening to it tap against the window. But out in the bush, when the temperature dropped and everything turned to mud, it was a different story. It was worse when I was alone. I had planned the trip for a few weeks. I had time off work and wanted to get away from the noise of the city. I picked a spot a few hours outside of Melbourne, deep in the Victorian bush, where few people went this time of year. It was winter, which meant the nights would be freezing and the rain would be relentless. But I had the right gear. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sky was turning a dull gray. The sun was already hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind carried the smell of rain. The dirt track leading to the campsite was rough, with deep puddles from previous storms. My old Uda handled it well, but I could feel the tires slip in places. The site was nothing more than a small clearing surrounded by tall gums and thick undergrowth. There was a small fire pit left by previous campers, but no other signs that people had been here recently. I liked that. I wasn't in the mood to deal with others. I set up my tent quickly, knowing the rain could start any minute. I had a good quality one, waterproof with reinforced seams, but I still made sure to put a tarp underneath and another one stretched over the top, tied tightly to nearby trees. I built a small fire with dry wood I had brought with me, just enough to cook dinner and keep me warm for a bit. The first drops of rain started just as I finished eating. Slow and steady at first, then heavier. I moved everything I could into the tent, making sure nothing important was left outside. I sat under the tarp for a while, watching the fire die out, listening to the rain. It was peaceful for a while. The sound of water dripping from leaves, the distant roll of thunder, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. Normal bush noises. I had been in the outdoors enough to know what was natural and what wasn't. But then I heard something that didn't fit. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting through the trees, but then I heard it again. Movement. Not the light scurrying of a possum or the snap of a branch from a falling leaf. It was heavier, deliberate. I told myself it was probably a kangaroo. They were common in these parts, especially at night. But something about the way it moved unsettled me. It wasn't the random thumping of a roo hopping through the bush. It was slow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I turned off my headlamp and sat still, listening. The rain made it hard to hear anything properly, but every now and then, I caught the faint crunch of leaves, the shift of wet branches. Stopped for a while, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had just been an animal passing through. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. The rain got heavier as the night went on, drumming against the tent. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to a different noise. Footsteps, not far from my tent. My stomach turned cold. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The footsteps weren't hurried. They weren't running or stomping through the bush. They were slow, careful, circling my campsite. I reached for the knife I always kept in my pack. My hand wrapped around the handle, gripping it tight. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, there was nothing but rain. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was the steady downpour, the occasional gust of wind shaking the trees. Then something brushed against my tent. A light touch, just enough to make the fabric shift. My grip on the knife tightened. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, every muscle tense, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The rain continued. The wind howled through the trees. The sounds of the bush slowly returned. The chirp of insects, the rustle of leaves. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and heavy with mist. The fire pit was just a pile of wet ash. My Uda was covered in mud. Everything looked normal, but then I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud around my tent. Not animal tracks, not kangaroo or dingo. Human, barefoot. They circled my campsite, moving in and out of the trees. At one point, they came right up to my tent, stopping just beside where I had been sleeping. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't waste time making breakfast, didn't even check if I had left anything behind. I threw everything into the Uda, started the engine, and got out of there. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, the wet highway stretching out in front of me, the bushland disappearing in the rearview mirror. I never found out who it was. Maybe it was some local messing with campers, maybe someone living rough in the bush, maybe something worse. All I knew was that I wasn't camping alone out there again. Not after that night. Losing my grandmother changed something in me. She was the one person in my life who truly understood me. Growing up, I spent every summer at her house, deep in the countryside, where the nights were still and the mornings smelled like pine and damp earth. She taught me how to fish, how to build a fire, and how to appreciate the silence of the wilderness. When she passed away, I felt lost. A few weeks after the funeral, I decided to go camping alone. I needed the quiet. I needed to be away from the world, to sit in the woods and remember her. She used to take me to a remote spot near an old logging road, deep in the forest where barely anyone went. I hadn't been back there in years, but it felt like the right place to go. It was late autumn, just before the first snowfall, when the trees were bare and the wind had that sharp bite to it. The drive out was long, and the roads were rougher than I remembered. My grandmother used to tell me that roads like these were forgotten by time. As I drove, I thought about how she would have laughed at me for coming out here alone. I reached the turnoff, a barely visible dirt path that wound through the trees. The ground was covered in damp leaves, making the drive slow and tricky. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. There were no houses, no signs of people, just the thick woods pressing in on both sides. Eventually, I found the clearing where we used to camp. It was exactly as I remembered, just a flat patch of land surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek running nearby. The air smelled crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the trees, close enough to the creek to hear the water but far enough to avoid the damp ground. As I gathered firewood, I noticed how quiet everything was. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That first night, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I thought about my grandmother. She had always seemed invincible, but time had taken her like it took everything else. The fire crackled, and the warmth felt good against the cold night air. After a while, I turned off my lantern and climbed into my sleeping bag. The forest was pitch black. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was footsteps. Not the quiet, shuffling steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps. I lay still, listening. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent, moving along the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded. I reached for the flashlight beside me but hesitated. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again, moving away this time, back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every little sound making my pulse race. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the air was icy, but there were no signs of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my head. I told myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe, or my mind playing tricks on me. But as the sun started to set, I felt uneasy. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. That night, I built the fire bigger than before. I sat with my back to the trees, watching the flames dance. I didn't want to go into the tent. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I froze. Then, another snap, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight, my breath shallow. The fire cast long shadows across the trees, making it impossible to tell if something was moving out there. I stayed by the fire for hours, listening. The sounds came and went. Rustling, snapping branches, the occasional thud, like something heavy shifting in the darkness. I wasn't alone out here. When dawn finally came, I made the decision to leave. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my backpack without bothering to fold it neatly. I just wanted to get out. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. Footprint, not an animal's. Humans. It was fresh, I didn't stick around to find out who it belonged to. The drive back felt longer than before, every turn in the road making me anxious. I didn't relax until I saw the highway, the first sign of civilization. I never went back to that spot again. I still think about my grandmother sometimes, about how much she loved that place. But I also think about that night, about the footsteps, about the feeling of being watched. And I wonder if she ever knew what was really out there. I was camping alone in the French countryside, not far from a small village whose name I can't even remember now. It was sometime in early autumn, the kind of weather where the days were still warm but the nights had a bite to them. I had been traveling through France for a few weeks, mostly sticking to hostels and cheap inns, but I wanted to spend a few nights outdoors. There was something about being alone in nature that I had always found calming. I had picked a spot near a forest, about a 30-minute walk from the village. There was a small clearing with a soft patch of grass, and the trees around me formed a natural barrier from the wind. I had everything I needed, a good tent, enough food, and a small gas stove to cook on. I had even picked up a bottle of cheap wine from a local shop to enjoy under the stars. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, had a drink, and lay back, staring at the sky. There was no one around, just the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I slept well, waking up early with the sunlight filtering through the trees. The second night, things changed. I had spent the day exploring the village, picking up a few supplies and chatting briefly with a shopkeeper who seemed surprised when I told her I was camping alone. She gave me a look, like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. I didn't think much of it at the time. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was already setting. I set up my small stove to cook a simple meal, the smell of food filling the air. I wasn't in any rush. It was one of those perfect, quiet evenings where everything felt still. Then I saw him. First, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. A figure standing between the trees at the edge of my campsite. I looked up quickly, but he was already gone. I shook my head. Maybe it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but something felt off. I ate my meal, but I wasn't as relaxed as I had been the night before. Every so often, I glanced up, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness. When I finished eating, I cleaned up and got ready for bed. The temperature had dropped, and I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipping it up tight. The tent was small, just enough room for me and my gear. I left my boots outside, but everything else stayed with me. I wasn't sure what woke me up, but it was sometime in the middle of the night. I opened my eyes, heart pounding, listening. First, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. Leaves rustling, distant animal calls. Then I heard it, a footstep, not an animal, not the wind. A slow, deliberate step. I held my breath. My tent was zipped shut, but I could feel someone just outside, standing there, listening. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. The sound of my own heartbeat was loud in my ears. Another step, closer this time. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, even though I wasn't sure what I would do if someone tried to get inside. Then, nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't move, just waited, listening. Eventually, I heard footsteps again. But this time, they were moving away, slowly, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, gripping the knife until my hand ached. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, heart still pounding. The ground was damp with morning dew. My boots were still where I had left them. Everything looked the same, except for the footprints. They were faint, but they were there. Someone had stood right outside my tent, just standing, watching. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked back toward the village, I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I reached the village, I went straight to the shop where I had bought supplies the day before. The same woman was behind the counter. She looked up as I walked in, and before I could even say anything, she frowned. "You left early," she said. I nodded. "Didn't sleep well." She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "You're not the first."
Esther here.
"What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in slightly. "There's a man," she said. "No one knows who he is. People see him sometimes, always near the forest. Just standing there, watching." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but I didn't. I didn't want to know. I just thanked her, bought a coffee, and left. I never went back to that campsite. Never camped alone in France again. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. The footprints, the silence, and the feeling of someone standing just outside my tent, watching.